Welcome to Smarty Plants, a Minnesota Department of Agriculture podcast informing citizens about invasive species that affect our environment and agricultural resources. My name is Jennifer Burington, and I will be your host. Invasive and noxious weeds affect places far and wide in Minnesota. Today, we will be discussing how two of Minnesota's tribes manage these weeds on their sovereign lands. Joining us is Defoe from Fond du Lac Band and Raining White from the Leech Lake Band. Phil is a Red Cliff tribal member and belongs to the Fond du Lac and Lac de Flambeau communities as well. He went to the University of Wisconsin-Superior for biology and focused on botany and entomology. He has worked in water quality, air quality, and invasive species over his career and has worked for the Fond du Lac Band for 13 years. He is currently working as an invasive species specialist. He spends most of his time outside of work raising children and taking part in traditional Ojibwe seasonal activities. His favorite things to do are to take part in treaty harvesting and growing food for his family and community. Thanks for joining us, Phil.
Thank you.
Raining is a Leech Lake Band member and has the great opportunity to work for his tribe for the past 7 years. He started as a seasonal invasive species technician, removing terrestrial species within reservation boundaries. His second season, he was hired as a crew lead for invasive species work. He then was able to stay on as a full-time permanent employee. In 2023, he was made the assistant program manager for the plants department and has since helped grow the department and expand their capacity. His most recent focus has been on aquatic vegetation and aquatic invasive species. He is passionate about water, tribal sovereignty, the environment, and gathering or hunting local foods. Thanks for joining us, Raining.
Leech, thanks for having me.
So to get started, we'll kind of cover a little bit about each of your tribal lands. So how are tribal lands similar to and different from other lands in Minnesota?
First of all, if it's all right, I'm going to introduce myself. Buju Bejuwa Ashindigo Anishinaabe Wong, Miss Kwabikong and Duji Minoa, Mizwe and Dunjaba, Kwandudem, Nagachiwinang and Dano Ki, invasive species specialist.
Thank you.
I would just say that the state and the reservation both share similarities in the sense that they have boundaries that they operate within, and they also have public land and private land. I think where it differs is when with the reservations, most of the lands are fractionated, and so you have private land ownership, tribal land ownership, you have state and federal land ownership, industry sometimes own land within reservations, and then also private tribal ownership. So we have all these different fractionated lands within the reservation boundaries.
Yeah, I'd say it's pretty similar for Leech Lake. If I can introduce myself too, because I think it's important to speak our language on things like this and in general. Buju give me one addition to cause, Cha-Cha Bonning and Nujaba, Magizi Dudam. But yeah, I think Phil covered it pretty well. You know, we're pretty fractured in our ownership of our land, but we do have jurisdiction within the reservation boundaries. So for noxious weeds, for example, we can set our own lists of what we want eradicated, removed, you know, and they don't necessarily have to align with the state list. And in my mind, you know, I'm not a tribal lawyer. Tribal law is very, very complicated. So I'll preface with that. But, you know, we kind of take precedent over our own jurisdiction and our own ordinances over the state. And so we really focus on what we want as far as going with the state rules and regulations. So federal, it's a little bit different. You know, we have to interact with the federal government, kind of nation to nation. But with the state, you know, we really value our sovereignty and our decision making.
Nice. So what does it mean to be a sovereign nation when it comes to land management in Minnesota? Raining, if you want to continue.
Yeah, again, it's a very complicated issue. Sovereign, you know, to be completely sovereign is kind of hard to do and as a Leech Laker because there are so many different ownerships within our reservations. We share 40% of our land base, I believe, with the Chippewa National Forest. which is a federal agency. So, recently we got into a memorandum of understanding with them, renewed a memorandum of understanding, basically having shared decision making on those lands, which is a huge step for us and for the United States Forest Service. But I think being sovereign, is just the ability to use our rights that we've retained when these treaties were signed. It's kind of a key point to understand that our harvesting rights and our hunting and our treaty rights weren't given to us. We retained them when we signed these treaties. So, the federal government isn't allowing us to do these things. We are in agreement that we have always done these things and we continue to do them, and that they recognize that. So I think that's very important to understand sovereignty in that sense. That Leech Lakers and every tribe in Minnesota was here before Minnesota existed, and they'll be here, and they continue to be here. So to be sovereign to me is just having the ability to understand that we are a sovereign. I think they call them domestic nations in federal law, but it's laid out in the Constitution how the federal government interacts with us, and so just having that ability to make our own decisions around our natural resources, around our courts and our ordinances and things like that. For land management specifically, like I alluded to, we have our own noxious weed lists, our own regulations for hunting and fishing and gathering. And so we really prioritize, our tribal citizens, and then folks that live within the reservation that are maybe non-tribal. And then we kind of go to the table with the state and kind of decide what is best for everybody. What can we do together? So.
Yeah, and it's our inherent right through treaty making. Treaties are supreme law of the land, and we retain the right to hunt, fish, and gather within our ceded territories. That's for Fond du Lac, that's the 1854 ceded territory, and 37. And we push our sovereignty to the fullest any moment that we have. And so to have control, or not so much control, but say over what happens within the ceded territory and within the reservation boundaries is very important. And again, that's pushing our sovereignty to the fullest, and we do that in every chance that we get. And those resources, those beings that give us life, that's what really encompasses all of that, and why we push our sovereignty so much.
Thanks. And this one you'll probably have some differences between the two tribes here, but what are the main goals your tribes have when it comes to noxious weed management in particular? Phil, if you want to start.
Sure. The main goals is pretty much all of our plans and our long-term goals for having a relationship with invasive species revolve around harvesting our traditional foods and medicines. So with that in mind, that's how we plan forward ahead, and we always, as human beings, we plan generations ahead. We also do the same for as advocates and a voice for those that can't speak for themselves, or maybe they can, we're just not listening. But being that advocate, we plan ahead, generations ahead also. So those are all integrated into, the way that we have a relationship with invasive species.
Yeah, I would say that our goal at Leech Lake, we kind of pivoted towards restoration. So instead of, removal and eradication, we want our lands where these, maybe not so good for humans or agriculture, these species of plants that are affecting us in some way, we want to return that to maybe what it was before they came in, maybe not quite pre-colonization because our climate has changed and our environment has changed, but to get it more of a balance where we're not constantly removing something. Because if you take something out, and you don't fill it back in, they come back. I think we all know that as people that work with invasive species. And I guess so restoration, is kind of at the forefront of our management policies, especially when it comes to noxious weeds, and just making sure that we are respecting the native plants there and giving them space to come back and thrive. And I think that's really the biggest part of it, is just kind of changing our philosophy and looking at, it's not a battle. It's not, these kind of combative language. We want to understand what's going on, why they came here, where they came from, and how do we work with that to restore to our lands that our people can use.
Mm-hmm. And so, kind of continuing on with that, like, how does tribal weed management philosophy, and you talked a little bit about this, Raining, how does your both of your tribes' weed management philosophy agree with and differ from the state of Minnesota's approach? Just kind of, you kind of alluded to a little bit about protecting the native species as a priority, whereas sometime with the noxious weed list, we have the specific list on what people are supposed to do when they find each of these particular species. So if you want to continue your conversation on that a little bit, Raining?
Yeah, I think early in my career, I was sent to a climate adaptation training in Red Cliff, actually. But that kind of really changed, flipped a switch in my brain, because they talked about, invasive species, noxious weeds, they make it so harmful that these plants are just existing, mostly brought here by human activity, if not all of them by human activity. And so just, and I'd get frustrated, my first season working, pulling garlic mustard for 10 hours. And I would smell garlic mustard in my dreams. And I'm like, this is so annoying. And it's so, what is wrong with this plant that it's doing this? And I went to this training, and they talked about language about, around climate change, and kind of philosophy from at least the Ojibwe, that these aren't, noxious weeds. They're not out to harm you on purpose. They're not, parsnip didn't evolve to harm us. It's trying to protect itself with its sap. But and so they said, maybe we can start calling them non-native beings. So it still addresses that they're not from this area or whatever area you're in, but we still have to respect them as something that's living, and try to understand, what is happening that's making them kind of take over certain places or things. So I think just from hearing that, I think there could be a big language change, and kind of in general of noxious weeds. It's so, I don't want to say negative, but combative, where there's a lot of the war on noxious weeds, or the we got to pull them and cut them, and, all these things, which is definitely a necessity, but it just, for me, it makes me so tense. I got to gear up and go knock out all these weeds and eradicate them, and, make them disappear. So I think that, that kind of differs a little bit for Leech Lake, at least. And, but, there is agreement that these things maybe shouldn't be here. And what can we do to kind of to steer that back to, more of a natural and complete ecosystem? And
it's a delicate balance.
It is a delicate balance.
Because on one hand, you want to preserve the native species, and then but on the other hand, you have to have a relationship with them because they're here now. Mm-hmm. Respect all life. So how do you work with that? And that's the challenge that we step up to and we take on.
Yep. Yeah, that's a good point. So yeah, that's really all I have to say about that part. I think we're not trying to butt heads with the state on purpose in some of these, in all these areas of tribal sovereignty. But so there is agreement that, some of these things have to be taken care of. But how do we take care of them is kind of what I find the most different between different agencies.
Yeah, and I'll add something to that. When I first started working with invasive species, we would get out, we would, you know, go out and weed whip tansy and kind of lower their populations. The goal is to minimize populations to a manageable amount. I was out weed whipping, and I got into it, put my headphones on, was listening to music, was really getting into it. Maybe a little bit too much, because later that night I had a dream as everything was black, and a tansy plant came to me, everything just nothing but blackness. You could see this tansy plant just vibrant, and it slapped me in the face hard, and I woke straight up out of my sleep, and I was like, what in the world was that? Well, you know, I was taught to go put tobacco out and think about that for a little while, ponder it, so I did that. And I think really what it was it was reminding me to have that respect, because that's a living being. And really that's the philosophy that we put forward, you know, that these are living beings, and I think that may be where things are different between the way that tribes approach things and then, you know, the state might. And I'm not saying all state, you know, I'm sure there's people within the state agencies that see things that way too, but in general with planning, you know, I think that's how
the institution was kind of set up in that way. And yeah, if we're talking about philosophy, you know, there seemed like I was taught, you know, that as a human being, I'm part of this world. You know, I'm not disconnected, and so for my work, you know, I'm trying not to dominate something. I'm trying to, you know, would Bruce Lee say, be like water, flow with it, you know, and kind of adapt and understand, you know, that humans aren't separated from our natural world. We're integrated into it directly, and that can really give us power to change things and adapt and, you know, help things heal, I guess.
So continuing with you have different approaches and different philosophies on weed management. So what are some of the methods that you use by both of your tribal authorities, if there are some similarities or differences?
Yeah, we try to, you know, our plants department is expanding, but we're relatively, you know, historically pretty small. So our capacity expansion is a huge goal, and so we look at technology, you know, whether it's biocontrol. We've used biocontrol on purple loosestrife, for example. We got some knapweed, weevils, leafy spurge, beetles. So that helps us, you know, it's kind of set and go. We focus on populations that are maybe isolated that can benefit from, you know, biocontrol. But we use, you know, we don't use chemicals at all. And we can talk more about that later. But so we do a lot of hand pulling, mechanical removal, kind of labor intensive things. But it, you know, so with our limited capacity, we got to focus on areas that are going to make a bigger difference. So we're focused around community centers for parsnip, for example, or, you know, high traffic areas if there's a big population, a ditch or things like that. We did just get some drones, which I'm super excited about. So, you know, we have all sorts of these sensors on there that we just learned about last week. So thermal and multispectral. And so we're, you know, implement that kind of thing to kind of guide our decision making on management. Because, you know, when I first started, there was like 3 of us out there, and there's, you know, 800,000 acres within the tribal boundaries. So you could do the math. There's a lot of work to be had. You know? So anything that can, you know, make that work a little easier and expand our capacity, we're always open for. And new technology, you know, we're always seeing what's in the line for biocontrol. You know, we have a hot water machine that we just got this year that we're going to test out. It's basically going to steam plants to death. So it's, you know, non-chemical, but it will be a little bit quicker, hopefully, than you know, traditional methods that we use like cutting or herbicide on the state side. So, you know, when you don't use herbicides, folks say, well, what are you using? You know, they want a solution. They want you to come up with it. So we're willing to try anything, you know, see how it does. But
Yeah, we mostly mechanical efforts. It would be nice to have drones. That's in the plans. But really, most of ours, we are two to three person unit most of the time. Maybe might get a couple seasonals to help out, but yeah, most of it's mechanical. And we actually do use a little bit of herbicide. It's a last case scenario when it's used, and it's always at the lowest effective concentration. Overall, majority of what we do is mechanical through stressing through mechanical means.
Yeah, I think most people that work with noxious weeds or invasive species management, I think we've all had many hours of pulling the different, especially garlic mustard.
Oh yeah,
I think everybody's had like hundreds and hundreds of hours, if not more, of pulling garlic mustard, and you cannot just not see it everywhere.
Yeah.
It's like, I tried so hard, and
That's
we just keep going.
the curse with invasive species work, you just
Yep.
you come to a new city and you're like, oh, there's some tansy. What are they doing with that? Why is that sitting there?
Yep.
You
Phragmites
see
in
them
Green Bay.
everywhere. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Phragmites, yeah. As soon as you see it, you start to recognize it everywhere,
Yeah.
and you're like, oh, I didn't think it was much of a problem, but it really is. And I can see it all over. So in relation to that, like, we all kind of manage it differently, whether it's on our own, in our own yard, or at the park in the community. But like, how does noxious weed management differ for your tribal lands versus management recommendations from the state? You talked a little bit about using the pesticides. What else kind of differs? I know you talked a little bit about, too, the noxious. You each kind of have a different list on there as well.
Yeah, I think, like I said, in very rare cases, we will use herbicide, but the idea with that is that we try not to use it. For one thing, the majority of our lands are within our wetlands. That's always an issue with, drinking water and just the whole water topic. The second thing would be that we have the majority of our members and community members harvest from the land. And it could be anywhere. It's random. And then there are also like culturally specific places too that, like absolutely not, don't even get near it with any kind of herbicide or any kind of chemical. And so, again, the majority of what we have planned is based on harvesting for food and medicine,
Yeah, I think water quality is really important. Leech Lake has 3 of the top 10 largest lakes in Minnesota. 2 of those are in the top 4, I believe, Winnie and Leech. But so we're not, eradication. I think we all know eradication's not possible. Usually in a noxious weed management, so we don't focus too much on that. But like I said earlier, restoration. How do we, once we do clear an area, how can we promote that to get back to its natural state or more natural state? We don't use pesticides. That's a tribal ordinance, so that's again a sovereignty issue where, before my time, our citizens and our people, in our council created a pesticide ordinance that, it didn't straight up ban pesticides, but they wanted more say of what pesticides were going in. And so there is, opportunity to apply for a pesticide permit, for example, but in my knowledge, one has never been given. And, we're 800,000 acres within our tribal boundary. And so we're really concerned about new things coming in. So we focus on right-of-way agencies, that may be doing construction or, maintaining their assets. So we really stress having clean equipment that's coming into the reservation. I know Fond du Lac does a little bit that. Kelsey was talking to me about that. And so really just we have enough to deal with. We don't want more and new things. So, that even goes into our water. We have a couple watercraft inspectors. We work with the state to make sure things from outside the reservation aren't coming in. We're making sure our citizens aren't moving things within the reservation. But it's hard, There's major throwaways coming through. There's private work that we don't know about with dirty excavators and things like that. So it's just trying to manage our little piece of little big piece of land for future threats and current threats, and just we're not busting down doors and writing tickets or anything, but we're really conscious of potential of these things expanding and exasperating, and there's only a few of us to do this, so we don't want more.
Capacity is always an issue with the tribes.
Yeah.
I know, like in the state agencies, the federal agencies, they have 5 or 6 teams to do what I do. Of people. That's always an issue, a hurdle for the tribes.
Mm-hmm. And you've talked a little bit, Phil, about avoiding the use of pesticides and how important it is for your tribe's weed management plans. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that? Like, what do you talked a little bit about trying to both of you have talked about trying to plant the native. If you remove something, trying to plant and get the native plants to grow that are natural to the area. But do you want to talk a little bit more about the reasons why avoiding the use of pesticides while people are out foraging and gathering?
Yeah, I mean, it stays in the environment for a long time, and there's no guarantees that something didn't drift off into a berry patch, or, they're digging something up for roots, for medicine, and, it's within the first inch of soil. I think those are the biggest reasons on why, again, it's based on food and living off the land, really. And Rainey was saying, like, some of the other things that we do are like, the biggest thing is early detection, and so that can complement not having to use herbicides if we can get early detection out. We do our surveys, we're making sure that decontaminations are happening with equipment, and even within boats and waterways and things like that. I think the biggest thing is early detection. If we can get a lot of our effort into early detection, then we may not have to use those things, and that's the goal.
Yes, early detection is very much key to, and all of the options that you have available to manage any type of invasive species, whether it be an insect or a plant or disease. Like, it's amazing to see the amount, if just detecting something early before it becomes a huge problem, how much less management between hours of pulling weeds and possibly not having to use chemical pesticides and herbicides and things like that to manage the larger populations, and having that biocontrol option. That's always nice to have, as well as that you have an insect that can target specifically a plant and help manage that population and bring that population down and help keep it at a low level. So,
yeah. For Leech Lake, when I kind of got more into a management role in our department, I was kind of tasked with this pesticide question. We had different agencies asking, well, why don't you use pesticides? Can I get a permit? Can I apply for a permit? For some reason, I had to handle all that, which is fine. But so I did some digging, and I talked to some other DRM employees that have been there for quite a while. And the story was that there was some broadcast spraying within the Forest Service, and from helicopters, I think, or maybe planes, but there was some drifting of it where, as we know, that happens. And then our community members started seeing, their berry patches looking a little rough. They reported some deer acting funny or doing strange things. So, that their treaty rights were being directly affected. They can't harvest poisonous, berries covered in poison, essentially, or deer, that are acting funny or starving. And the Forest Service, to my understanding, was doing this for timber to clear out, the understory for timber harvest. And so that's when that was enacted, I think it was the late 90s, maybe early 2000s. And so we've had that since, and that's kind of been the stance of Leech Lake, is to avoid pesticides and avoid these chemicals that, the label may say one thing, but, what is that doing to all these other, the little details, the fungi and the insects and the, berry production and the mammals, how long does this stuff stay in our soil? All these questions that, we don't really have the capacity to research. We're managers, we're not research scientists. And so, it was easier for Leech Lake to just get a ban, to get a control, to, protect our treaty rights, because although you can eat garlic mustard, I think blueberries taste a little bit better. So we'd rather protect those than, worry about, broadcast spraying and some of this drift and, affecting our constituents, our tribal members' rights, to harvest, because every tribal member has that right, and we don't want anyone to impede on that.
Yeah, there's only so much pesto I can make, and I'd much rather have some blueberries than have pesto every day with the garlic mustard. So speaking of specific species here, like garlic mustard, are there differences in which weeds your tribal authorities manage from those managed by the Minnesota Department of Agriculture?
Yeah, I can give an example. It's not necessarily, might not necessarily be on the noxious weed list for the state, but mullein, can be considered a nuisance species. And so that's something that we, as the tribe, just decided to not treat or mess with at all. We have quite a few community members that harvest that and turn it into medicine, and they give it away. It's actually used a lot by our community members. So we just don't do anything with it. We keep an eye on, the areas where it's growing, and we have it mapped out and things like that, but we pretty much don't do anything with it because they want to be able to have good medicine to use. So that's just an example. There's others too, but yeah.
For Leech Lake, our lists are pretty much aligned. But, sitting on the Noxious Weed Advisory Committee, there is, some statewide, there's things that aren't affecting us that we feel like we shouldn't maybe have an opinion about because, they're not affecting us directly. And so, I've been advised to kind of understand that it is a statewide committee, but representing Leech Lake on there doesn't maybe always align with some other members of that council's or committee's views on certain species. But yeah, I think we're kind of out for the same goal, as to manage our lands for our people, whether it's state citizens, which our people are state citizens, but they also have that unique status as tribal members. And so I think just creating a healthy environment I think we can all agree on that. So.
Yeah, and so you talked a little bit, Raining, about the Noxious Weed Advisory Committee. The MDA also is on that committee, and that's what helps create the noxious weed list, at least the state-recognized noxious weed list with all the different categories and all of the species on it. So how do your tribal authorities and the MDA, along with other agencies, collaborate on noxious weed management? And then also with that, what could be improved on in the future with those collaborations or other opportunities?
Yeah, for Leech Lake, I talk about the Forest Service and their spraying, and they, we kind of work that out. And I kind of started my career where there was kind of these shifts in interactions with tribes, you know, whether it was state or federal. They're kind of, I don't know if taking them more seriously is the exact phrase, but these relationships were building. And so for me, it's like, oh, well, you know, these were always pretty good. Like the state's listening to us, the counties are working with us, the Forest Service. But then I have to remember the history. You know, it's not too long ago where the Forest Service was spraying our resources, or the county was ignoring our pesticide laws within the reservation. State was writing tribal members tickets for harvesting Winnoman, wild rice. And so it's good to understand that history of, in my lifetime, these things were happening, and it's going in a positive direction now. I was invited to be on NWAC, the Noxious Weed Advisory Committee. I sit on the statewide Aquatic Invasive Species Advisory Committee. My boss, Kate Hexton's on a dozen committees, it seems like. But yeah, just, having those conversations and understanding, tribal sovereignty and, how can the state interact with that in a positive way? How can counties interact with that in a positive way? And just, coming to the table. Some of the best relationship buildings is just calling up someone, where people, in my experience, some people hear tribal and they want to tiptoe around it, and then, and they don't want to talk to us as, managers, they kind of separate us. But, it's just give a call, if you're doing work within a reservation or want to do work within a reservation, I would just suggest opening that conversation up and being honest and prepared to maybe take some criticism. But it's just, things are moving in the right direction, but there is still a lot of historical trauma that, people don't forget. And I think it's important not to forget that.
Yeah, and I'll add to that trauma part. I think this is a conversation that I don't just have with state agencies, but with federal agencies too, anytime I get an opportunity. And that's that, as a people, we've dealt with several layers of trauma and drastic changes within our people and our homelands, but also the land has too. And, going from completely old growth forest to decimated, nothing but tree stumps for miles and miles and miles, that we've learned a few things since then, and how to survive and thrive following such a devastating thing to the land. And just like what happens to the land what happens to us happens to the land also. And so my conversation with agency people is always that, if you take the time to sit down with tribal people, there might be something we can teach you. We've had these compound trauma situations happen, and we've thrived within that. And we have some things to talk about and bring to the table that maybe haven't been heard before. And I guess that's my biggest thing is that, if you're willing to come, sit down, be patient, turn off your mouth and listen a little bit, we do have some things to teach, and not every tribal individual you're going to talk to has maybe is even willing to give that input, but just taking the time and being willing to sit down and have a conversation with our tribal councils, especially get to know who our leaders are. Each individual band has a different government. And if you just take the time to understand those leaders, they're in those positions for a reason. So.
Yeah, thank you. I know I've had many conversations. It feels like going in the right direction and having these open conversations and being able to talk about all of these things and pass ideas around, just like we're doing here, talking about the different ways we manage things and how we look at things differently. So it's always good to have that connection and that discussion just to start with. And so that's what one of our reasons for having this podcast here today is to discuss all of these things and to share that and start that conversation so people can have that with others as well and continue that work.
The power of conversation, is so important and so strong just to understand each other, in general. But, with Minnesota especially, you have 2 of the 11 tribes of Minnesota in here. And we can only represent what we know from our tribes. And so, find out what treaty territory you're on, find out who your neighbors are as far as tribes and reach out to them. And, we're all unique. We're all pretty similar in that, the Minnesota Chippewa tribe, we're all Anishinaabe and our Lakota, relatives down here in the South. But I think that celebrating that uniqueness and that these nations are, autonomous and doing their own thing, and to understand that really helps expand others, especially in the natural resource world, to do better work, I think, overall.
Yeah, and definitely if we can cooperate and combine together that the few people from each of the agencies and each of the tribes and stuff working together, you all of a sudden have just 2 people and then you have 10 people. So having those collaborations definitely helps. And I know you guys talked a little bit or mentioned about research and stuff like that. There's a lot of research opportunities that we try to have to work with different tribes on different things, especially with the University of Minnesota with some of their invasive terrestrial plants and pest center. That they try to incorporate that and expanding on that relationship as well. Just slowly starting out, but expanding and growing and starting to form those relationships. So
we're getting there.
And just a reminder that, I'm not sure about Leech Lake, but Fond du Lac has an IRB. Make sure you hit them up if you decide wanting to do research with us.
Okay. Yep. Yes.
But also here we are, right? We're having a conversation, and this is what needs to happen.
Yeah. And exactly, it's the more conversations you have, the more you learn and the more you know. I definitely like having conversations instead of just just some words on an email, being able to talk things through and to have that relationship and that in-person contact. So, or at least by phone too. But yeah, is there anything else you guys would like to add before we wrap up here?
Miigwech Wizendoyeg. Miigwech for having me come and share a few things. And raining, and everybody in the room.
Yeah, miigwech to everyone. Gigawabim, and we'll see you later.
All right. Well, thank you, Phil and Raining. It was great having you on to talk about tribal weed management today. It has been a fascinating topic and a great opportunity for us to learn more about your tribal values when it comes to land management. This has been Smarty Plants, a podcast from the Minnesota Department of Agriculture. Our producer is Brittany Ravel, our editor, Larry Schumacher, and I have been your host. You can learn more about pests and other invasive species that affect our environment at www.mda.state.mn.us. And while you head to our website, we'll be working on the next episode of Smarty Plants. See you there.